Hello, everyone. We are here in our task facilitation group. That's myself, Katie Galligan, Craig Lordster, Roxy Moore, Caitlin Osler, and Rachel Tuckrello. We are going to present to you today Resilience in the Face of Disaster, San Francisco Earthquake. In order to present to you how we would present a psychoeducation group to our chosen audience, which is a social work classroom, we're first going to describe the history of the San Francisco earthquake and subsequent fires of 1906, including key points from our course materials. We're going to be viewing actual footage of the San Francisco earthquake and asking the group questions about human nature in the face of disaster. We will lead the group to explore resilience when disasters hit, the lesser told stories that Solnit describes in her book, A Paradise Built in Hell. We will then move into describing strengths, weaknesses, problems and solutions, and short and long-term considerations for this specific disaster. We will describe how we would open and facilitate a larger group discussion to our chosen audience, that social work classroom. And finally, we will debrief about our process of planning within our task group. According to Handelsman et al., 2006, summarized in our text, there are many tips for successful facilitation, and these include creating an inclusive environment, encouraging participation, and presenting a unique perspective that will engage the audience. Therefore, in this facilitation to a social work classroom, we plan to utilize a relevant media presentation of actual footage from the 1906 disaster and engage the audience in a contemplative discussion about whether or not they believe in humans coming together or demonstrating resilience, or whether they believe what the media typically presents, according to Solnit, that communities are prone to collapse upon themselves in the face of disaster. So after we showed this video, we would ask, is there anything striking about the video? As you can see, the devastation is pretty severe. I was pretty alarmed when I watched this, so assuming similar reactions will come out of this. And then lead the students in a discussion about what they think happened in this disaster situation. And then we will transition into the true history of the disaster. So getting into the who, what, when, why, and how. So what we're talking about, 5:12 a.m., April 18th, 1906, a 7.8 to 8.2 magnitude earthquake hit the city, caused massive devastation, and 3 days of fires afterwards. So how did this happen? San Francisco, as many of us know, lies on the San Andreas fault line. The quakes that broke that morning broke water mains and set fires to the majority of the wooden structures of the city. Additionally, opposing forces, citizens versus National Guard government and military officials, caused even more fires by preventing civilian efforts and enacting what Solnit describes as poorly planned firefighting that created more devastation. Who were involved in this disaster? Of course, the people of San Francisco, that community that lives there, and anyone who was visiting. There is a discussion about many thousands of people residing in hotels when the earthquake hit. Citizens, military personnel, government officials, the elite, who were mostly wealthy, white and male, and less wealthy individuals of the city, including individuals of color, women, servants, etc. Key elite described in the book or discussed in the book include the mayor, General Funston, who guided the military force, and the police. Key citizens included the Schmidts, who founded Schmidt's Family Kitchen, and Anna Holzhauser, who set up an outdoor kitchen and camp as well. Writer Lafler called this a war of those two opposing worldviews that were at odds during the earthquake. Specifically, old injustices and discrimination were fighting against neighborhood spontaneous relief efforts that seemed to negate the status quo based on race and class. Important numbers to consider, some statistics of the disaster. 3,000 individuals died in this disaster. Depending on the source that you look at, 50 to 500 estimated were killed by occupying forces. The true number we will unfortunately never know because their bodies were lost in the fires. 28,000 buildings over 500 city blocks were destroyed. And again, that devastation you can really see in the film that we would show to our group. Over half of the 400,000 citizens became homeless. And so there was these camps that were set up all over the city that you can see in the video and also this photo here. In those accounts of the disaster and the letters and essays of survivors, a remarkable picture emerges of improvisation, heroism, and solidarity, similar to what can be seen in most disasters, but is seldom recorded. That's a quote from page 23 of the Sunlit book. Many survived the earthquake with gratitude and generosity, she says. Edwin Emerson recalled that after the earthquake, when the tents of refugees and the funny street kitchens, improvised from doors and shutters and pieces of roofing, overspread all the city, such merriment became an accepted thing. Everywhere during those long moonlit evenings, one could hear the tinkle of guitars and mandolins from among the tents. These beautiful words describe the overwhelming resiliency that came about after this disaster hit this city. People existed on generosity and equanimity, and there are many examples of individuals really coming together in this instance and taking care of one another. So moving into strengths and solutions on the part of the citizens. Over 50% of the citizens were all of a sudden overnight homeless. Strengths were displayed and short-term solutions to the disaster were provided almost immediately by the citizens, setting up tents, setting up communities, as you can see in this photo here, rallying to feed one another, looking for people in burned down buildings, collecting bodies. I mean, really intense resiliency efforts on the part of the citizens of San Francisco. They were remarkably resilient, remaining calm and joyful in the face of losing everything. 3,000 people and many more injured. They were even joking and laughing and singing, meaning they found a purpose and they took pride in remaining a community, even without building structures, possessions, and organization. They became houseless, not homeless, as Sunlit says in the book. Their shared experience eliminated confining boundaries as life happened out in public and strangers of all walks of life felt free to speak and walk with one another. Money no longer had value. Acts of heroism occurred as policemen, firemen, and ordinary citizens rescued people from burning buildings. People started camps and soup kitchens to feed their fellow citizens, such as the Mizpah Cafe, which became a community center and fed up to 300 people every day in the aftermath of the earthquake. And it operated until June of that year. Strengths and solutions by government leaders. Up to this point, we have described a lot of government leaders as being opposing of the citizens, but there was some short-term actions that were altruistic. They provided tents to citizens, kept camps sanitized as much as possible. While most of the destruction was caused or exacerbated by government officials, they did provide some assistance. Longer-term efforts were needed to restore the city organization, to rebuild. The aftermath of the earthquake was, the city was just leveled. So there was intense efforts for years after that to build the city back up after that disaster. Upsetting the status quo, there were long-lasting consequences of the earthquake and its aftermath, as just mentioned. For some of those who went through the experience, the earthquake had lasting effects and changed how they would go on to live their entire lives. It gave some a glimpse of what could be, which changed their lives or inspired them to go on to do great things. A Chinese teenager, Hu Quang Liang, snuck onto a ship and started a new life in Napa Valley with his other relatives after he was essentially orphaned and abandoned by all his family in the disaster. The earthquake influenced the philosophy of William James, who was a professor at Stanford University in 1906. His experience after the earthquake allowed him to see that it is human nature to respond to disaster in a way they did in San Francisco, with a civic temper, not just warring attitude, which again, Sunlit describes, the media often portrays. The power struggle that results from disaster makes social changes possible. It really brings to light that status quo and the problems and the devastation that can come from that. Dorothy Day's contributions to society are one example of this inspiration. At age 8, Dorothy Day was deeply affected by the generosity she saw in people after this earthquake. Just 8 years old, she made it her mission to help the poor, and in 1933 founded the newspaper called The Catholic Worker, as well as a movement that eventually consisted of 23 mutual aid shelters called Houses of Hospitality, and which inspired study all throughout the country. And these ideas came out of her experience being a child in that disaster and seeing how beautiful it can be when communities come together. We would then go on to discuss weaknesses during the disaster. Citizens wanted to work together while soldiers, military wanted citizens to leave. It seems citizens were setting up self-help groups to cope with the tragedy in different areas all throughout the city. The groups were anyone and everyone working to support each other. There are reports that soldiers seemed threatened by the groups and did not want them to succeed. Again, this is because of their perception that these groups that were banding together would be prone to cause even more chaos and havoc in the face of this disaster. Our text explains self-help groups are diverse groups. They can be small, large, represent different ways of life, shared concerns, or in this case, a shared experience in disaster. Citizens could not protect their homes or help fight fires. And there are a lot of reports of citizens attempting to fight fires and losing their lives in the process, not because they were lost in the building or trying to fight the fire. They were shot by police and military men, etc. The military showed signs of Machiavellianism, which our text defines as leadership that believes people or citizens are untrustworthily weak and should be manipulated to get what the leader wants. Short-term considerations build rapport with each other, working with each other to save more lives and structures, or a more democratic group that was coming about of the citizens' efforts would have been potentially more effective. Unfortunately, what ended up happening again was that the military and policemen were shooting and killing citizens, a lot of them citizens of color or immigrants. Soldiers thought people were looting even when shop owners had told citizens to go in to get supplies because the community was banding together. Individuals that were given permission were still shot down. They wanted to keep things under control, they being the military, and there was no time to ask questions or use force. No time to ask questions, so they just used force. In desperate need of stopping the fire, they went to a strategy that they had never used before. So there's this description of people, policemen, firefighters trying to use dynamite to disrupt the fires. Instead, it backfired, caused more fires. No one had trainings on these explosives. We hadn't yet learned from multiple earthquakes in San Francisco. And so long-term considerations became better training on how to fight these fires and how to understand what happens in the face of disaster. A lot of the issues that came about were caused by this perception that citizens could not be trusted. That Machiavellian leader attitude really backfired in this instance. So we would also lead a group facilitation to our undergraduate classroom. So we decided that we would separate the students in our undergraduate social work classroom into small groups to discuss how they anticipate they would respond to a disaster within their community. So following the group discussion, the students will come back together for a larger group whole classroom discussion to reflect on their responses to the activity. Our group members would facilitate this discussion with the students about disaster response, emergency preparedness, and resilience. Again, the first activity would have set the stage for our students to be thinking about communities and how they would function in different communities in different geographical areas would have different disasters. So, I mean, we've been hit with a lot of fires in California. I live in Portland, Oregon, so we would be talking about earthquakes, tornadoes, tsunamis, etc., whatever would be relevant to our population based on geographical area. In our small group activity, we would ask specific questions. What type of disaster would occur within your community? Flood, fire, heat, earthquake, tsunami, earthquake and tsunami, earthquake and fires. As a group, we would select one natural disaster to focus on. We would ask our students, what would you think to do first? What would you, or who would you want to contact first? Do you have an escape plan? What would you do if you didn't have access to the phone, internet, electricity? Because those things would probably be wiped out in the face of a disaster. Group facilitators would walk around the room to engage the students in various groups, provide support, guidance, listen in, see how the discussion is going, but it would be student-led. And the facilitators would only provide guidance and support if needed. We would then come back together for a large group discussion led by facilitator, whole classroom. We would ask, how did the small group activity make you feel? How do you think you would have responded in 1906 when the earthquake occurred? How do you think that you would respond now? What types of technologies exist now that would impact the disaster? Do you think disasters impact people differently depending on race, age, and socioeconomic class? That was definitely true in 1906. How might that apply in 2018? We would then ask our whole groups, what role do you think you would play in the aftermath of a disaster? Now, we're in a social work classroom, so they would probably be very inspired to ensue with philanthropic activities to help the community. We would ask for specific examples of how our students would do that. And we would spend about 15 minutes on this large group discussion. Group facilitators would review to discuss some of the common physiological, emotional, and psychological reactions and responses to the disaster. Some of these will have naturally come about in the small groups and the larger group discussions, but to make it a well-rounded discussion, if the facilitator felt that there were some physical, emotional, and psychological responses that hadn't been discussed, this would be where the facilitator would really help fuel that discussion, so that we can be sure that the students understood the short and long-term effects of trauma and resilience within a community that faces disaster. We would also talk about applications for this kind of work in the social work field. There are a lot of social workers that do go in the face of disaster. Maybe some students in the classroom would want to talk in further depth about careers in this kind of emergency or trauma response. According to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, also known as FEMA, these are the most common reactions to disaster. The agency refers to these symptoms and reactions as disaster-caused stress. The group facilitators would take turns sharing the points on the slide and would ask students if they can think of additional reactions to disaster-caused stress and any additional strategies that may be helpful in overcoming a disaster. Additionally, according to FEMA, these are some healthy strategies to alleviate the stress caused by the disaster. The group facilitators would take turns sharing the points on the slide and would ask students if they can think of additional reactions to disaster-caused stress and any additional strategies that may be helpful in overcoming the disaster. With all this discussion about the San Francisco earthquake in 1906 and completing the group activity, you might be wondering, am I prepared for an emergency? This slide provides you with a list of recommended items that can be used to create an emergency supply kit. This list was created by FEMA through a campaign titled Ready that is designed to educate Americans on emergency preparedness for natural disasters and other potential crises. We have a resource at the end of this PowerPoint to review the full emergency supply kit. They actually have ready-made supply kits also for sale on Amazon nowadays. So we have certainly come a very long way in terms of understanding emergencies, resilience in communities in the face of disaster, and ways that we can be more prepared as smaller and larger communities experience more disasters. We learn from these experiences. On this slide, you'll find some resources that can be used to assist individuals that have recently experienced a disaster. There are also resources listed to help individuals who are interested in emergency preparedness planning. So again, this is a social work classroom. This discussion might be inspiring to the students to explore various ways that they could operate in this capacity in a career possibly. Moving on to our debrief. To come to a group consensus, we did not have a lot of issues in designing our presentation. We actually started a very early conversation, early in the planning process, weeks before the assignment was due. We initiated this conversation via the Blackboard discussion for our group. We also started emailing back and forth. Members were open to assisting in any way possible, and several people expressed different ideas regarding presentation topics, audience, and task timelines. And group consensus was actually not an issue for us at all, which was nice. Flowed really nicely. In terms of problem solving, our group did not encounter many issues again. Members freely volunteered themselves for tasks early in the process. Electronic communication made this quick and easy. After the project was underway and Professor Kirker released a video in the announcements describing audience, there was brief concern within our group that the overall tone and audience of our presentation, being a social work classroom, was possibly off base. And so one of the group members alerted the group via email to watch the video, get thoughts, and then reach out to co-instructor and post in the Q&A to make sure that our topic and audience was on track. And it actually ended up being, that was one problem that came about, resolved itself pretty quickly. And potential issues were identified by individual members that then presented questions in a democratic voting, asking for guidance type of way. And once consensus was reached among the group members, or majority was reached, we moved on. We also utilized the discussion board and emails for general guidance and thoughts, asking about presentation order and other logistics, making sure that all tasks were assigned in our presentation, although completed by individual members and then put together, still flowed nicely and operated as a cohesive project as opposed to just several PowerPoints kind of glommed together. In terms of decisions, our method for decision making was very similar to how we dealt with problem solving and planning. Our conversations started in the assignment group tab on Blackboard, moved to discussion board and email threads where members could respond back to one another, offer feedback, voting on materials, tone, and overall expectations that we all had of one another for our project and our finished project. There was a brief discussion about doing conference calls at the beginning of our group planning process. However, one issue that we did come into contact with was among all of us, we all work full time and go to school. And so our different schedules and the number of people made that a less efficient way to do this project, even though it may have been ideal. So we decided to go with the efficiency route and use electronic communication, and that ended up working out really well. Again, although it wasn't an ideal, this is really relevant to the work that we do in the social work field. We often have limited resources, have to do things very quickly, and so we might get into a problem-solving exercise with ourselves and our day-to-day jobs and our future careers where we find best practices and ideal, and it's less efficient. And so we're always kind of, as social workers, balancing how do we still have high quality work, make sure that we're following our code of ethics set forth by the National Association of Social Workers, and how are we still meeting the needs of our clients. This is something that's very applicable to us. Our group reflected both laissez-faire and democratic leadership styles. Our assigned group leader is a co-instructor, and her role was mostly to be present for any general assignments, questions, and/or concerns. Outside of that, she was hands-off and allowed the group members to lead and decide on their own. The democratic leadership style was represented by a few group members who voluntarily took on that leadership role and facilitated voting via email and things of that nature to make sure that the leadership role was offered in structured guidance and organization when it was needed. Otherwise, we were pretty hands-off and everybody was independent in completing their tasks and everything went really smoothly. Leadership style was democratic because members provided input again, and the ultimate democratic process is voting. We used a lot of voting to make sure that as the project was evolving and pieces were coming together, that everyone still felt comfortable and solid with the final project that we all contributed an equal amount to. So in sum, we described the history of the San Francisco earthquake and subsequent fires of 1906 to you all, and talked about and used that as an example of how we would facilitate a psychoeducation group to a social work classroom to really talk about how communities can be resilient in the face of disaster. We also talked about the strengths, weaknesses, problem solving, and other considerations for that specific disaster. We went on to talk about a group facilitation activity that we would complete to keep the presentation fun, lively. This would happen within the context of a social work classroom. So we would have about 60 minutes to present this entire thing and do both of those group facilitation activities. So while our group would operate and be mostly student-led within their small discussions and larger discussions, the facilitator would really need to be on top of the timing and be keeping people on track. That would be an essential function to make sure that we're respecting the students' time. We ended appropriately, had enough time to debrief, etc. And finally, we debriefed and presented to you all on how our group completed tasks, came to decisions, solved problems, and what leadership styles arose and were demonstrated in the planning and executing process of this project. And here are a list of references. Thank you so much.